meanwhile, here we are diving into the last session on these. And all right, so by the end of this session, we are going to invest sufficient time to um, actually get things in on time. I say that, and people will inevitably only give themselves a half hour and feel really crunched. So we're also going to do some double checking of our budget narrative. That's usually one of the last things that I do is double, triple cross check the budget narrative. Um, Something that we didn't talk about in previous sessions, so I kind of snuck it in now, is thinking about how we can add visual displays of information to build strength to our proposal. And then the other part we'll spend a bit of time on is what to do if you either, yay, get your proposal funded or do not. You're not done one way or the other. You still have to do something one way or another. So that's where we're headed. And then looking into our summary of the grant writing workflow, we have sort of roughly divided these into thirds, covering them each session. So we have hopefully edited the whole thing by now. We have a more or less complete, polished narrative proposal. And then there's some other things that we still need to think about. And even what I have noticed is you have to go all the way into whatever submission portal you have, because there's almost always like one more question that requires 100-word answer or something that they didn't tell you about anywhere else. So we're going to look at that. We're going to write out the budget narrative, and we're going to think about, again, those diagrams or pictures. And then we are going to figure out getting all the way to the end and hitting submit before the deadline. So, all right. This is my tip of the day, probably one of the most valuable things. Make sure you can get into whatever you need to be able to submit the proposal. So I'm highlighting this grants.gov portal because if you are, let's say you work for an organization, if you are not the person who has authority to submit a proposal, this little button won't be there. And no matter how much time and energy you have put into preparing the proposal, if you are not the person who can hit submit, you can't get it in on time. So make sure, like, go in a week ahead of time. Make sure that you or the person who does have that permission can get in there and make sure that it's all copacetic. Just word to the wise. It was so stressful when someone's on vacation who has the password and da 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 da. So do it far in advance. I also have noticed this even for sort of easier proposals. Sometimes there's just little hoops to jump through in these online portals. We'll also say occasionally and very occasionally there will be options to just like print out your proposal, put it in a physical envelope, and mail it off. And then you may want to consider, doing certified mail or something like that and getting a stamp so you can verify that they received it. So things like that. Make sure that the funder receives your proposal. No point in doing all this work if the funder never gets to see it. The other thing that's really worthwhile for doing is making sure, as I said, there's not sneaky other forms or other information you need to identify. I have found, like, I always need a list of congressional districts that I'm going to be working in for these federal grants. And it's like, it doesn't say that anywhere. And then you're at the last minute and you're frantically, Googling which congressional districts are in West Texas, right? So do it ahead of time. Make sure you have that list. Like area of work is often separate. Like if you have to actually make a shape file and send them a shape file of the geographic boundaries, right? Like you just want to know that before the deadline, well before the deadline. So those are some things that have caught me out. Keep your eye out. Those are my tips. I think because there's so many gazillions of options of different things people may ask for, my invitation is look for those things for yourself. I can't possibly anticipate all of the crazy things that vendors will ask for. So, all right. So, to the budget narrative, if you'll remember from session one, we did ballpark the budget ages ago. And we have had some sort of internal template to do the calculations and make the adjustments. Cool. When we actually submit, we actually need to have that be sensible to another human because the spreadsheet usually makes sense to us, but we need the reviewers to agree that that budget makes sense. So the best strategy I've found is to just ask the program officer if they have an example that they will give you. That way you know that they're already used to looking at this kind of information and then just plug your information directly into their template. That's far and away, I think, the best option. I work for UNM, so I have to always do an internal budget for them. And then there's things that I try to simplify and translate to the funder as much as possible. If you'll remember, another one of my tips is our job is to make it easy on the reviewer. So, internal codes or fiscal years that don't line up to the calendar year, right? Anything we can do to simplify that information for the reviewer will be helpful. So this is an example, one that came off of a federal USDA. They gave us this sample budget narrative. So all else being equal, if the program officer doesn't have one, Google one and see what makes sense. There's some things I really like about this. There's lots of white space, right? If you don't have a page limit, like make it easy to find the information, right? Put white space in between things. Other principles that we talked about last week of like have things in the same order every time you talk about them, right? So year one, year two, year three, very obvious that that is a logical order. But let's say you're not going to spend any money in year one. I would still put year one and put a zero just so it's consistent and cohesive and makes sense. It means the reviewer won't think that you've forgotten it and you won't forget it, right? If you do things in the same way every time and have it in the same order every time, you won't forget it. So everyone, we had a question last time of like, when do I talk about myself or me who's doing the grant? Sometimes it's in here in personnel. You'll say something like, is an expert in soil microbial ecology and also will tenuously advise the project team. Right? Yeah, probably shouldn't say tenuously, but if you're being very honest, you can tell them that you're really a soil microbial ecologist, but you've learned how to look at spreadsheets. So we talked about trying to have some sort of visually pleasing way of conveying information, even though it's complex information. What can we do to simplify? And then broadening out from just the budget narrative, we can think about that throughout the proposal. So if you have the space and if it's allowed, sometimes proposals are text only, then you have text only. But if you have options of uploading some figures, and then it doesn't push you over the page limit, be very careful of page limits. We've already talked about a couple of figures that you could consider adding in. We talked about the timeline, right? Like adding in the timeline that you use to brainstorm. If it was helpful to you to visualize how this project would go, it may also be helpful to the reviewers. You've already put in that work. Format it nicely and present that to the reviewers may be helpful of justifying that you have thought all the way through this project. You can do it in the time and budget that you're asking for. Likewise, with this logic model framework, I have put logic models into my proposals sometimes, just because it's such a nice step-by-step summary of some complex information, right? It's like sort of a snapshot of here's my whole project in a snapshot. So we've talked about those before. Some other options, tables, right? So this was the table I put in a recent proposal, and I was trying to highlight the diversity of these different counties in New Mexico that I was proposing to work. And having these figures side by side is a really striking way of showing there's a lot of variability. It also demonstrates that I've done my research and I know the populations, I know who I'm working with and working for. Photos, man, sometimes the picture is worth 1,000 words. If you're like, I'm gonna work on building these rock structures to reduce erosion, and you're not sure if the program officer has ever heard of a media luna or whatever, add a photo, right? Clear as day. I'm gonna build 50 of these across this landscape. Cool. That is very clear to the reader. Otherwise, you could do diagrams. So, because I do a lot of experimental ecology, I often include diagrams of just talking about this proposed field setup and talking about what's fenced and unfenced and where the permanent transects are and which ones will get composted and not. So, um, certainly making diagrams I find really helpful of, again, connecting the reader and engaging the reader in different ways than just text. And finally, I would say don't underestimate the value of, excuse me, like a hand-drawn diagram, right? Like, totally, like, I'm guessing people could sort of guess what I've conveyed here. Like, here's this plant and some roots, and there's some interesting things happening with water at the soil surface, right? Um, so this I probably wouldn't put in a proposal, but you know what I have done? I have I'm not a great artist, but I've done diagrams and put watercolor, and I have used those because it was actually looked better than what I could do on PowerPoint or whatever. So don't underestimate, like literally sketch it out by hand, take a picture with your phone, put it in the proposal. That may just be the glue that's needed to tie your proposal together. Be judicious, try to make it look polished, but don't underestimate how can I simplify? How can I give this information to this person in a simple way? And then of course, because lots of us are doing land-based work, if you're doing it across a wide swath of the country, having a map can really sort of exemplify, right? Like at a glance, you know that this project is spanning something up in the mountains and then something pretty low and then something in the middle, right? So just with a visual image, you're actually giving people a lot of context and information. Does anybody have any other ideas for what sort of figures or imagery that you've used besides text and proposals? Is there anything that's been effective? I've seen in the Healthy Soil program, I've seen people do like literally with their cell phone, just like field tours, and they're narrating what you're looking at. Totally, it was really effective. How about you, Carlos? And if you could go one step further. If you were asking for funding, actually, I know one of you was emailing me, like you secured funding for part of the project from a different funding source, and you've started part of the project, and then you're asking for funding for a new part of the project. You could include, here's what I've already done, here's where I am, right? That would be so visually impactful of like, here's all the work that's already happened. Starting now, here's where I'm going to go forward with this new funding. So there's ways of thinking about really emphasizing your assets, right? Emphasizing the resources you already have. Great. I mean, I think the other thing, we talked about like, having a diagram of something in the real life, but you could also have, I think they call it word clouds or whatever. You could have how different concepts relate to each other, right? If you are talking about like, this project really does have an aspect over here and an aspect over here. cool, let's visualize that. Like how do these disparate ideas fit together and how are they related? Yeah, anything you can do to help the reader. Like I almost always will put graphs of pilot data, right? So I'll actually put um, data or a figure in there. But yeah, like the pictures themselves of like or a fence line comparison. Oh my gosh, fence line comparisons are so compelling, right? But same thing. Like here's the before, here's after. Now I want to scale this up. Imagine what the world could be. Pictures and models of before and after. Yeah, love it. Yeah, anytime we can get that artistic eye, and I love that also of just taking the time to appreciate what we're doing, right? It's like we're so busy doing it. Sometimes you gotta like take the time to be like, if we have polished whatever figures and supplementary material or a link, a static link to a YouTube video that we can share. We have gotten the budget and we've gotten the budget narrative and they match. That is really key. We have matching numbers everywhere. Um, Okay, so we are done. Hallelujah, we think we're done. We are not done. We still have to upload them. I oops. I give myself a half a day. I give myself a minimum of 4 uninterrupted hours to upload a grant. That and I have done everything else. Like all of the writing is done, but I give myself 4 hours. I block it off of my calendar, out of office on my email. No one can bother me. I am just uploading things. Oh my gosh, I said this, I think the very first sentence of this grant writing webinar, double check the time zones because you can be late accidentally if you're on the East Coast or the West Coast, vice versa. Double check the time zones. Um, I would have your request for proposals or a checklist, and making sure that you have uploaded all the optional attachments. Oh, here we go. Budget numbers match. Really, it's important. That's why I say it like 7 times. Um, this is a really important one. It is so fiddly sometimes to get these all uploaded, and you're like, I just want to be done. I just want to hit submit. Almost always they give you the option to download and view it before you hit submit. I would definitely do that. Sometimes when you upload, uh, formatting will change, and you will now be over the limit of your page numbers, right? Like it just like I don't know why it happens. You'll put a PDF up on a website, and suddenly it's changed formatting, and now you're over your limit. Or something that I found is really common is if you do have a graph or a figure or a photo. Has anybody ever seen like where you have a square with a big X in it, right? You're like, that's not what I want to submit. I want to submit this before and after photo instead of two X's next to each other. So make sure that what you're seeing on the end is what you in fact intended for the reader to see. And this is definitely why I give myself the 4 hours, because so many times I have had to go in and edit, right? It's like I just can't make this PDF not give me 4 pages and 1 line of text. I got to go in and edit it out so that when I upload it, it fits the page limits. It just happens. So give yourself lots of time. And then after all of that, after you have checked the application, made some fixes, re-uploaded the whole thing, checked it again. Every time you upload, you want to check that final PDF. Please don't forget to actually hit submit or send. Speaking from experience, I have done this. I have done all of the work and then I almost didn't hit send, or like every once in a while, they'll hit send and then there's like another page and you have to hit confirm. Oh my gosh, make sure that you hit everything, all of the buttons to actually send it. So, yes, make sure you actually submit it. And word to the wise, I really have almost missed the deadline. So, all right, we have we have gotten all the way through this whole 12 steps, but we are not done with the webinar. One, we should celebrate. Getting a grant, like this is a lot of work just doing this. Hopefully, along the way, you have built up some relationships with partners that you maybe worked with before and are deepening a relationship, or you're expanding out to some new potential collaborators. Um, Hopefully, all of these budgets, timelines, logic models, hopefully those are helpful for you to think about your projects anyway, right? Hopefully, spending some of this time thinking about it is not just wasted on just this one grant. Hopefully, it's helping you conceptualize some other things. Um, and then, yes, and then there's lots of other things that you just hold your nose and do it because you have to. But I do think parts of these process can be helpful anyway. So celebrate, you did it. So way to go. And then you can be out of sight, out of mind for a minute. All right. You've done all of that work. I'm so sorry. They are not going to fund you. That there's like, it unquestionably stinks. You put all this work in, you've built these relationships, you don't get the funding. But don't stop there. Wallow. So I will admit, even though I say this, read the comments from the reviewers as soon as possible. I can never bring myself to read the comments the same day. I never can. I like feel really disappointed, sleep on it. I usually read the reviews the next day. But you have to read the reviews as soon as possible. In some circumstances, if they have really screwed up, you have a case to bring to the funder. If they said, oh, well, they never addressed XYZ specific thing, but you did, and they just, maybe their pages were glued together and they flipped past it, right? There are very rare circumstances, but there are certainly circumstances that you should say, I think my proposal deserves a second look. It looks like this was just a mistake and they missed this piece of information. You can do that. Doesn't always work, but you can do that. And if you don't do it right away, very little is likely to change. So you got to do it right away. Everybody gets you. Right? Like not everybody gets people have their own biases and everything else. You are still awesome and your project is still great, even if the reviewers are not reflecting that in this moment. Okay. Here's where you can transform that negative experience into hopefully something that's beneficial. Hopefully, from our first session, you are very organized with your documents and where you've put things. If a reviewer says something like, it was really unclear the timeline of this grant and how it was going to actually get done. Boy, is that actually really, really precious, valuable information. I'm going to immediately go back to my timeline, give a second look, and make some edits directly because I'm already thinking about what's the next time I'm going to put this in and how can I make this proposal better. So while it's fresh in your mind, take that valuable feedback and put it right back into your proposal and make direct edits to those documents. I usually do a new copy, right? I try to keep what I actually submitted as sort of its own thing, but I'll make a copy and say a new version. Unfortunately, if you have built up these relationships with partners or other folks, you do need to let them know that there's not the funding for this proposal. Often that's a source of mutual wallowing, but let people know because they might be waiting. Here we go. Find a new place to send it. It's a great idea. It just didn't fit with that funder's priorities. You're going to thank yourself for being organized. All that work you did setting up your workflow, you can copy and paste that and start new for the next place you're going to send it. So all of that work you've put in at the beginning is going to pay dividends kind of especially if you were rejected, because you'll have all that structure to put it in again. And then the secret fifth way that part of me says don't do this because I'm really trying to have people not do work that they're not getting compensated for because I think it leads to burnout. But depending on the priorities, it may be worth it to figure out how to do it anyway. So we didn't get the grant. How can we, have a big potluck and a whole bunch of neighbors come over and everybody just builds erosion control structures together? Like everybody's benefiting from slowing down the water on the watershed. Maybe we can do it anyway, right? So think about it, or reach out to other folks who did get it in your region and be like, hey, I heard you guys just got the SIG. We would be a great demonstration site. Here was the part, we've already planned it out, right? It's worth it it's the whole never hurts to ask kind of thing. Okay, so I hope I have emphasized, even if you don't get it, your work is not done. You still have some things to do with that proposal to sort of finish out that cycle and get it ready for the next submission. I will also say there are a bunch of proposals that I have had rejected, and I'm in like year 2 or 3. I haven't actually turned them around and put them back out in the world yet. But it doesn't mean I won't. It just means they sort of drop down my priority list. I feel fairly confident that I am organized enough that even 2 or 3 years later, I can pick up and be ready to start a submission again because I really gave myself notes and breadcrumbs right away after getting the rejection. So it doesn't mean you have to put the proposal in the next month. In my case, I have 2 proposals that I can think of off the top of my head that I'm into like year 2 or 3, and I haven't put them back in again. But I will one of these days. All right. So you don't get it. That's kind of a bummer. I'm also going to say, yay, you did get it, but now you actually have to do the work. Sometimes that can be pretty overwhelming. So I am not an accountant, I'm not a lawyer, any of these things, but I have white knuckled it through tracking some of these grants. And so I'm going to give you a couple of tips with the caveat that, follow your legal or accounting professionals advice. So we're gonna think about setting up your grant tracking workflow, how you're going to report and what you need to report on. You need to pay attention to that. Right away, reaching out to the partners, letting them know you got the grant, figuring out if you need a contract with them or if you need some written memorandum of understanding. Staying in communication with the funder is really important. So I have had, various timelines of I'm awarded the grants and then actually getting the agreement done requires some back and forth. And it can be, 4 to 8 months, in one case over a year, before we could actually start the project. So, and all of that required keeping track of my emails, being responsive when they ask for more information or revisions. So really keep your eye on any correspondence from the funder is a tip. And then for all of this, I want you to be tuned in to what does this mean for the next project? What am I learning from this project that can help me in the next project? And some of the things I'm about to show you are ways that I do that. Any information you can keep track of and that can give you better information for the future is beneficial. So I'm going to go there next. But meanwhile, and let's emphasize again, if you get a grant, you should celebrate. That's very cool. So you get a cow with its tongue stuck out. All right, so I'm going to, so that you don't have to design this yourself. This was given to me, or a draft of this was given to me, and I've I've slowly refined it through time. But this is a example of the kinds of information you're going to need to keep track of throughout the time of your grant. You're going to need to keep track of your deliverables, what you actually do, and you're going to need to keep track of the money. And so this is sort of trying to capture both of those things a little bit in one place, and then I'll show you one other method that I use. So I set up something like this where there's some key information. Who's the grantee? You or your organization? What's the official program of the grantor? What's the project timeline? How much did you get awarded? How much do you owe as match? You remember from our match conversation, and what's the total project cost? I found it's really, really helpful to keep track of, they'll almost always assign you a code, right? Of like your grant 24-0480 dash dot whatever. If I put that code in emails to the funder, it smooths the relationship. They know exactly what I'm asking about and can respond pretty quickly and easily. So I try to keep track of their number, that sort of external code. And then, usually internally, there's some internal code like composting in New Mexico or like field two planting or whatever, right? Like there's the way we think of it in our heads. But it's useful to keep track of the number they give us. So in this section, whoa, oh no. I try to keep track of what I said I would do in a pretty succinct way, right? So in this proposal, my imaginary proposal, I had 5 deliverables. I have some brief descriptions. If I wanted to put notes in here and when I should probably have it done. I can also estimate the cost from my proposal, what I thought these different deliverables might cost. And then I can have a place for the actual time and cost. Can you see how this information might be helpful for you the next time you put in a proposal? If you go, man, I thought 2 workshops would cost $20,000 and actually it costs $35,000, well, you better make sure the next time you write in a proposal that you're writing in $35,000 and not $20,000. Or if you think you can get this done in a year and it actually takes 20 months, then when you go back to your timeline for the next grant proposal, you have much better information. You can be much more realistic and not stress yourself out, we hope. So this little section is really aimed at the deliverables. This section, I'm just going to caution you to be really, really careful to complete this based on the agreement. I have personally made the mistake of putting in these numbers for my tracking spreadsheet based on the proposal, and they were a little bit different than the final agreed numbers. And so I got off in my tracking, and it was very time consuming to fix. So you're going to put in this budget information when you have an agreement with the funder. If you have a federal funder, the categories are very fixed and they will tell you exactly what go into the categories. If you have a different kind of funder, you could change the names on these categories. But this is coming directly out of the budget, and you know exactly how much you asked for each of these categories. You could have pulled that from the budget narrative, things like that. Cool. All of that is stuff we know from the proposal. And now we start actually doing things and we start actually spending money. So here, I'll actually come over to here first. So, some people might have QuickBooks or some other system to help them keep track of these things. If you don't, if you're a farmer or rancher, I still highly, 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 highly recommend that you keep track of per person, per day, what activities you did. speaking from experience, I have been audited, or well, through my role with one of the organizations, one of my projects was audited. And the thing they asked for was proof, documentation of per person per day activities, as well as receipts for everything. Um, so, best practice, keep those records. Again, it will be helpful to you to know how much time you really spent on things. If it was $20,000 for two workshops, or if it actually ended up being $35,000 for two workshops, keep track of it. So the simplest way would be something like this, right? You have the date, you have which person, you write down briefly what you did, you say, oops, this is supposed to be deliverable. This is which deliverable here does this match up to? What's the hourly rate? How long did it take? And then there's some equations in here. And you can customize this to however is helpful. And then from these, so you'll see this is, in this case, the only thing that I did. So here's 143.5 is the cost. I'll add some numbers here. Yeah. And so you can see these get layered into, here's how much I spent on personnel. So that matches up, and fringe. And then keeping track of your expenses, right? So you spent some money on a website developer for $1,470. That category is contractual. It goes towards this deliverable. And then where is the receipt? This could say it's in a box, in a shoebox under my bed, but just give yourself a breadcrumb. If you ever need to prove to the funder that you spent this money, you need to have the receipt. So knowing where the receipt is going to be really helpful. So here again, here's this contractual category that gets put right here. And then I've built in some equations so that I know the total direct expense and then that indirect, which we talked about in part 2, which is the cost of doing business. And then together, that's my total. So this is how much I spent in a quarter. And I can, claim, put in a claim or request reimbursement, and then I can keep track of whether they paid me or not. Do keep track of whether they pay you or not. Sometimes they get behind just as much as we do. You want to make sure you get paid. But here's the thing. So in this case, there's 5 quarterly periods in this grant. The other thing that's going to be really useful for you to keep track of is the total, the running total. And so with this template, I've built in the equations that here's how much remains. Oops. So we know that we have $12,000 left to spend on personnel, and we have $21,000 left for contracts, right? And it's just at a snapshot. Keeping track of this means you're less likely to go way over budget. So I cannot tell you how useful keeping these running totals has been for administering a grant. So this is, of course, a little more complicated than some of the projects, but I would say the big picture is having some place where you can keep track of your deliverables and whether you did them or not, how much they cost, what you're spending money on, which categories of expenses you're spending money on, keeping track of how you can document those expenses is going to be an important thing to think about. And then making sure you're not overspending. So it doesn't have to be this spreadsheet, but those sort of 5 things are something you're going to be wanting to think about so that you're not surprised at the end when they might ask for things like that. Speaking of, we always have phones with us. I take pictures of receipts and then I know I have a backup. It's not as good as being actually organized, but I at least know I have backup. Go ahead. again, think of the big principles and how it can align with what you're already doing, right? You don't want to add work to yourself. If you're already really good at keeping track of your receipts, you don't need to build in a new way of keeping track of your receipts, right? But you may, if you haven't been keeping track of the time you've been spending, that might be a place to build in a little bit of a new system, just sort of an introduction. So here's one. This is called Notion, like I say. This is just it's very customizable. I just used a template, and I have a table. So this is a grant I just got. Here's the two deliverables that I have here, and I have little drop downs of like major deadlines that I need to keep track of. Um, there we go. A lot of things were high priority at the beginning of a grant. so, uh, and then this is what I wanted to highlight. I have, okay, cool. I've kept track of when my narrative report needs to be done and when my financial report, right? Like I have noticed pretty often they won't always match up, right? Your narrative report might be due quarterly and your financial report is due half yearly. So getting yourself organized somehow with this, once I've put this information into this sort of checklist, the next step is I actually put time on my calendar in January. So I'll book myself now in October. I know I need to report in January. So I will just block off 4 hours on January 15th because I know I need to work on reporting so that it's done by January 31st. So building that sort of thing in for yourself and just knowing that it's coming so you're not late is definitely helpful. I think that's it. I stuck a budget like breadcrumbs in here. But really what I wanted to point out is give yourself some way of keeping track of what reporting is due and when.